Hello and welcome to today's webinar for mental health professionals, Race, Stress, and Black Mother and Infant Mortality, Emotional Health Matters, featuring Dr. Angela Neal Barnett and Kristen Farmer-Kane. My name is Vicki Spielman and I am the Associate Director of Membership and Marketing at ADAA. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer's audio system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select phone call in the audio panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be available as an on-demand webinar within 24 hours. All attendees should ensure they remain muted for the entire presentation to avoid background noise and distractions. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions at any time of the presentation by typing your questions into the chat box of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. For those who purchased CE/CME credit for this webinar, you will receive an email with a link to complete the webinar survey and post-test questions required to receive a CE/CME certificate shortly after the completion of this webinar. Please reach out to webinars@adaa.org if you don't receive this link. Would now like to introduce Dr. Neal Barnett and Ms. Farmer-Kane. Dr. Angela Neal Barnett is a national award-winning psychologist, professor, and leading expert on anxiety disorders among Black Americans, the first African-American woman to be tenured and promoted to the rank of full professor in Kent State University's Department of Psychological Sciences and in the College of Arts and Sciences. She directs the program for research on anxiety disorders among African Americans. Dr. Neal Barnett's current work focuses on sisters offering support, sister circles for anxiety across the lifespan, and the role of race and stress in Black infant mortality. Ms. Kristen Farmer-Kane is the Executive Director and founding doula of Birthing Beautiful Communities, a community-based doula and perinatal support organization whose mission is to prevent and reduce infant mortality and low birth weights in high-risk neighborhoods by culture, education, advocacy, and support and engagement. There will now be a brief moment of silence while I pass the presenter role to our presenters. Oh, Dr. Barnett, it looks like you're muted.
Sorry, I am muted. Hi, my name is Dr. Angela Neal Barnett, and I'm a professor at Psychological Sciences at Kent State University. And I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Ms. Kristen Farmer-Kane, who is the Executive Director and Head Doula of Birthing Beautiful Communities. I want to go over what it is we're going to talk with you about today. So our webinar objectives are fourfold. First of all, we want to help you understand the role of racism as a stressor in Black maternal and infant mortality disparities. We would actually advocate for emotional health for emotional health as the fourth pillar in addressing Black maternal and infant mortality disparities. We identify barriers to effective stress and anxiety intervention with expectant and postpartum mothers. And finally, what we're going to do is articulate for you and share with you some of our experiences and data in a culturally competent approach for assessing and addressing stress and anxiety in this particular population. So when Kristen and I speak, I always tell the same story. 5 years ago, I was in my office contemplating what I wanted to do with the rest of my professional life. My daughter was a senior in high school and would be going away to college, and I thought it would be fun. And so I planned to just sit on my deck, sit Moscato, and golf. And then Kristen Farmer Kane knocked on my door. And she said, everybody said I should come and see you. I'm a doula. I run a grassroots organization. And the researchers keep telling me that these women, our moms, are not stressed. But when we work with them and we talk with them, all we hear are stress stories. Can you help us? And so I said, yes. That was 5 years ago, and I've never seen my deck or golfed since. So if we're going to understand what we are going to presenting, what we're going to be presenting in this workshop, it becomes important that we understand racism as a stressor. And people always say racism, but they never really tell you what they mean. So there are three types of racism. The first type being structural racism. And I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to talk about structural racism, because this really is what led to birthing beautiful communities.
Thank you, Dr. Angela. Yeah, so a big part of my work at Birthing Beautiful Communities is looking at the larger picture of why we have so much disparity in infant mortality, but as a whole in our nation. So African Americans are not just suffering from disparities within maternal and infant health. There's also wealth disparities. There's also disparities within the healthcare system, and pretty much every other system that you can think of, which is outlined here. So there are policies such as in housing and redlining and the effects that that has had within the African American community. Um, Again, wealth. African Americans are 228 years behind in wealth, mass incarceration, and a war on drugs that was launched in the late 80s, early 90s, healthcare, the achievement gap within schools, as I used our example here within Cleveland Metropolitan School District, juvenile justice. There's a higher number of African American juveniles in the juvenile justice system, and there is a higher number of African American children within the foster care system across our country, specifically here in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County. And so if it was just infant mortality, then we can just specifically look at infant mortality to say, okay, what is happening within this sector that is causing such a disparity. But in order to truly understand the effects of why and what is causing such disparities, we have to look at systems on a larger level. And I often call that the macro level of work. And while we can continue to do the micro level of work, which is providing direct services and meeting the immediate needs of families, we also have to do our due diligence in admitting what we know and historically have seen within our country as policies and procedures that have disproportionately affected people of color, particularly African Americans, so that we have a larger scope of why we see the issues that we see within our communities. And so infant mortality is just one symptom of a much larger problem. And so to understand the totality of the effects of structural and systemic racism and its effect on populations of color, it's extremely important to consider the other factors that then contribute to poor birth outcomes to African Americans. And so for the longest time prior to meeting Dr. Angela, the thought was really just around we have to provide direct services to pregnant women, which is very true. But no one was really taking into account the emotional health of the individuals. We talk a lot about mental health. We don't really talk as much about emotional health or even have defined what that means and how some of these policies around structural and systemic racism contributes to the emotional health and well-being of individuals who now in this space we are talking about pregnant mothers, how that is affected, how pregnant women are affected by the issues that we see within our communities.
So we have thank you, Kristen. We have an understanding of structural racism. There's also something called person-mediated racism. And that's the type of racism I think we always think about. It's one-on-one, somebody behaves towards you or some group of people behave towards you in a way that you perceive as racist. And then the final type of racism that we're talking about is internalized racism. And here what happens is we take what people say about us and we believe it. And we believe it. It seeps into, for us, our mothers' minds and their spirits. Can you go to the next slide? So if racism, so one of the things that we have to really keep in mind is about all of these forms of racism is how they affect the Black mother. And one of the things that I think is very difficult sometimes when we go out, Kristen, for people to conceptualize is that it's not being Black that places women at risk for infant and maternal morbidity and mortality. It is being Black in the United States that places them at risk. And this is why we see that the disparities in infant mortality and in maternal mortality exist regardless of one's socioeconomic status or one's education. So in the Black community, there's an old saying, the old folks say, Black don't crack. And basically what that means is that that Black skin ages differently than the skin of other groups in this country. So it's really, really difficult to tell the age of many African Americans. And it's true, Black does not crack on the outside. But it's a whole different story. And if we go to the next slide, on the inside. And most of you recognize this as the HPA axis. And you know how that works. You know that stress begins in the brain with the hypothalamus, which is the thermostat of the brain, which signals the pituitary gland and which signals the adrenal glands to start secreting cortisol. And cortisol, as all of us know, is the lay term is the stress hormone. So because of the chronic stressors that Black women face, okay, so we've got the various forms of racism, which we know is a stressor, which we know is a chronic stressor, okay, then oftentimes the HPA axis of Black women, of Black mothers, is working overtime. And this overtime working of the HPA axis results in something that has been called weathering. And so weathering basically ages a Black woman's body quite quicker than we see in other groups of mothers or women in this country. And it increases the likelihood that she will have health problems at a younger age. And what we see in Black mothers, one of the things we see in Black mothers is that this weathering or the weathering hypothesis then results to a constriction in the uterine lining, which again is where the baby resides. Kristen, can we go back? I think we have a slide where we show some of the other effects of weathering. It's the one that says racism as a stressor and maternal and infant mortality.
Racism as a stressor. I think that may be later. Yeah. Can you talk about it?
Sure. So one of the things that I want to say is that we see a couple of things with racism as a stressor and this weathering hypothesis that contributes to this weathering. So we see things as there's greater disparities in mothers' access to healthcare providers. That racism, the lifelong experiences of racism, chronic racism, serve as an independent factor in premature births. And the leading cause of infant mortality in this country is prematurity. Racism, particularly chronic racism in all of its forms, can predict birth weight in Black women. And finally, it increases blood pressure between the second and third trimesters, which results in, which predicts lower birth rate, and which predicts lower birth rate, and then again heightening the risk for preeclampsia. Okay. So knowing all this, and knowing what Kristen was telling me when she knocked on my door, the thought became, okay, if we're going to work with these women, we have to truly know what is happening here. And so the first thing we did was we went out and talked to them. What is it that you need? What is it? What is it? What do you think about when you hear the word stress? What are certain stressors for you? And we also collected hair cortisol because hair cortisol is a proxy for chronic stress. And in the first, we had two samples, and I'm just going to talk about our first sample. And in this sample, these were women who were coming through BBC. What we found a couple of things. First of all, that the cortisol levels were trending lower. And it was associated with higher perceived racist events. So the more exposure that they perceived themselves as having to racism, the lower their cortisol levels were. So there were a number of women who had blunted cortisol levels, which, as we know, and one of the reasons why we're here is because that's indicative of anxiety and trauma. And when we looked at the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale, we saw that on average, these women had 3.38 adverse experiences. So what we took from this is, okay, we've got this population that where we may be seeing a lot of anxiety and a lot of trauma And what is it that we also need to assess? To the next slide. Okay. So remember when Kristen knocked on my door, the fact was that people were telling her that these women were not stressed, that they weren't seeing any kind of emotional difficulties with these women. And when we look at it, and so what we found was when we used the standard instruments, when we used something like the perceived stress scale, women were reporting little to no stress. But when we went to a mixed method approach, what we found was that in structured conversations, which we then coded using qualitative methods, this yielded the opposite. There were high levels of racism, highly stressed populations, highly anxious women.
So at the beginning, as Dr. Angela said, when I did knock on her door, I had been a doula for some years, and just in my own experience of providing services to women, there were some patterns that I saw around generational trauma. A lot of the women had very stressed relationships with their own mothers, and they had a lot of social and environmental issues that they were dealing with. And there were not many resources for those women at the time. And that's really what led me into founding Birth and Beautiful Communities in the first place, was that we could have a collective of women who were supporting women and addressing their needs in ways that we hadn't seen before, that were just not available from a government entity, for example, or just through programming. And I created this social risk assessment early on, just based off of my own experience, because I am a community organizer, and so I live within the community in which I serve, and I have very personal experience with people in my neighborhood, with family, friends, and etc. But I compiled 20 social risk indicators that I saw happening within our community, such as the number of losses that people were experiencing due to community violence. What is their history in housing? Were they in foster care themselves, or had any history of foster care? So an assessment that measures on five different categories and in 5 different ways their level of risk within those indicators. And so what it does is it then gives us a composite score based off of how they scored within the assessment. And then there's 4 levels of risk, and we've named them from kangaroo care down to cub care. This allows for us to create a perinatal intervention plan for the mother based off of where she is and her risk level. And it tells us the number of hours that we should spend with her during the duration of her time in our program. It tells us the types of classes that she should be taking. She may have specific issues related to foster care and trauma. She may have specific issues related to loss. And we map out a individualized plan for her so that she's taking the appropriate classes, that we facilitate those classes, and that we're making sure that she is attending the SOS and or Essence of a Woman series that goes into a deeper dive, so that women are actually identifying the sort of stress that they are experiencing, whether that is depression, anxiety, panic, and fear, as coined by Dr. Angela with the Sisters Offering Support Circles. And then the essence of a woman takes the even deeper dive into what is it that makes you a woman, what makes you a mother, what type of mother is it that you want to be, and really getting more into that generational trauma piece there, so that we are addressing the emotional health from the onset of her participation in our program. Because we realize that, again, as Dr. Angela has been talking about, it's not just about the services that we can deliver or the physical health of the mom, which is what the clinical side provides, but it's about how is she feeling during this pregnancy. And there's some limited research. There is some research out there, but very limited, around emotional DNA and the effects of how the mother is feeling. And its effect on the fetus in utero. But our theory is that if the mother is feeling a bit stressed and the baby, the fetus, consumes everything that the mother consumes, including her feelings, then a lot of times our babies are coming into the world stressed from the beginning, from the onset. In order to intervene there, it's important for us to measure the mother's risk, her social risk, so that we can help lower, in whatever capacity is needed, her stress levels, so that she is experiencing a healthy pregnancy, a fully healthy pregnancy, not just going to prenatal visits on time and making sure she's taking her prenatal vitamins, but emotional health is a big indicator of, how the child will be affected upon being delivered, and the type of environment that the child is being born in, and the type of environment the child will be going home to when they leave the hospital or clinic or birthing center, whatever. So this is for our team to, from start to finish, which is a total of 80 weeks within our program, to be able to support the mom emotionally as well as physically in the way that best serves her.
So to summarize, we are huge proponents of emotional health being part of the pillars of intervention in terms of infant and maternal mortality. Traditional, as Kristen has said, safe sleep education, early prenatal care, smoking cessation. This is what all programs do. We advocate for emotional, and we also advocate for it being delivered from people within the community, grassroots delivery of some of this of emotional health, because all of our research leading up to what is it that we're going to put in place for these mothers related to stress and anxiety came to the same conclusion: emotional health matters. So we're talking, and it seems like, well, this would be easy, right? But we're trying to do emotional health with Black urban mothers, and Kristen explained how we do this risk assessment, which really shows us that the barriers to doing this with this population. So first of all, you have cultural mistrust. So the fact that we are the same race as the women only gets our foot in the door. True, Kristen?
Very true.
Okay. But they have to trust us. And that takes time, and that takes commitment, and that takes consistency. They have to see us consistently in the community consistently doing what we say we are going to do. One of our most robust findings when we first begin to work with the mothers is that they don't believe that we're going to do what we say we're going to do. And so when we get to the end, what they tell the evaluator is they did everything they said they were going to do. And that information then gets passed on to other mothers who then come into BBC to work with the doulas. Again, someone who looks like them, under, or at least at the very least, understands their issues. Okay, access to good care in many of the communities that the doulas work in. There has not been access to good emotional, good mental health care. If you're going to this agency, then that means you're crazy. Okay. And so erasing, as we say, erasing that stigma around mental health, around emotional health. Then we run into implicit bias. And so just simple things. Many of the belief about these women is that they're having babies by many different people, or they don't know who the father of the child is. And people use terms like baby daddy. Uh, Nothing could be further from the truth for almost all of our mothers. They are in stable relationships. They are very proud of the fact that this is their second or their third baby. All my children are by the same man. They are very, if the father is in the house. So even if he has been incarcerated, there is still a relationship. And when he comes home, he comes back home to the mother. So a term like baby daddy, which people think, oh, that's just, it's kind of the, what it's called slang or just how you talk about things, is offensive to these women and immediately erodes trust. Kristen, anything you'd like to add?
Just the stigma, the last point, the stigma associated with African American women, Black women, the adverse images
Yes.
that are in the media.
Yes, and so the stigma also relates to these images of Black women as the idea that they're angry Black women. The other image is that of the strong Black woman. So if you are strong, then why on earth would you need help for what's going on with you emotionally? You should be able to work through it, to figure it out. The strong Black woman is such a powerful image, and so much so that to be weak and a Black woman is an oxymoron. So part of what we have to do is break down that idea, that barrier, that something is wrong with me if I have to seek emotional help.
Yes, and I would just add to that. We only really hear what's advertised really is around mental health and mental health matters, which I totally agree with. It's never really put into the context of emotional health, so people separate the two. And I think that that's why we haven't made as much progress as a nation. I would say that Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, Akron, and Summit County, because Birth and Beautiful is in both of those places. We have two offices. Is that this is the pilot, so to speak, of all of the work that we have been exploring and researching around emotional health, and with the hope that we will be able to spread this information across the nation, and in some ways have some things that are mandated as it relates to how expectant mothers should be treated, but what access they have to uh, emotional health services and perinatal services, which I'll talk more about, which I can just go right into that slide, the next set of slides, which is to give you an overview of Birth and Beautiful Communities, who we are and what we do. So as I said a bit earlier, I founded this organization formally in 2015. Prior to that, I was doing some work as a doula, and I primarily worked with African American women and younger women at that. And I particularly had these two clients that I always sort of talk about when I do webinars and I'm speaking, because it really speaks to how and why we really were formed. But I had two clients, one was 16 and one was 20 years old. The 16-year-old, she was expecting and she had been kicked out of high school. The high school, which is the high school I graduated from, ironically, had kicked her out and deemed her as aggressive, that she was fighting a lot, and these sort of things. And I was working with another doula at the time. She is a nun, a older white lady, which I specifically say that because we tag team on some clients, and she called me one day and she asked me if I could take on this client, these two clients in particular. And she just explicitly said to me, she said, "Hey, these are young Black women and I have absolutely nothing in common with them. While I can help them go through the labor and delivery," she said, I think that you may be able to reach them in ways that I can't. And so I took them on. The 16-year-old, when I went to go meet with her family, she, her mother, and her grandmother, who all resided in the same household, all suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. And not only that, but she was unable to read or write. And so a part of her aggression, a big part of her aggression, had to do with the fact that she was unable to confidently express herself. And another part of that, of course, was because she had suffered from some extreme traumatic situations. And apparently, in this case, it was generational. And so all I could think was that she's 6 months pregnant with a baby girl of her own. If there's no intervention, then this baby girl will surely have the same fate. And so I had a similar situation with the 20-year-old who suffered from anxiety. And so same thing in a sense that she had a very strained relationship with her mother. She didn't have a lot of support. And so there was, of all of the programs that both of them were involved with, no one was really addressing their emotional health, these issues around the generational trauma, the issues around the anxiety and the lack of support that the women had within their immediate circles. And so that's how I came up with Birth and Beautiful Communities, is how can we create a village-like setting, a community-like setting, to where we can where it matters most, which is, in my mind and my heart, was emotional health. And this is how I came to Dr. Angela, through that lens. We have two offices, as I stated, across 2 counties in Ohio. Our mission is to address and improve the systemic and community structures that lead to poor birth outcomes. We do that through culture, through education, through advocacy, support, and engaging the clients. We provide direct service. We are with the families for up to 80 weeks. That's from early pregnancy. We actually attend the labor and delivery, and we're with them until the baby is a year old. This is extremely necessary for the work that we do. It's very intensive work, and we really get to know the families, and we get to know their history, and we not only work with the mom, but we work with whoever is going to be around that baby on a regular basis. So if that, that's dad, that's the grandmother, we provide family-like classes and class structures, along with, again, trying to get to know the family on a generational level so that we are able to paint a picture of the experiences that they have shared and why some behavior that may not be in the best interest for the baby continues to get passed down, and being intentional about how do we help the family to think about things from a different perspective so that they are able to heal from the generational trauma that they have experienced in order to not pass this through to the next generation. Culture is extremely important because, for one, the death of Black babies and the death of Black women is what is causing such high numbers of maternal and infant mortality. If we were to erase or take away the Black and brown numbers of Black and brown babies and mothers who are passing away, then the United States would not be in such a dire position of having being a country that has some of the worst birth outcomes. It is the Black and brown babies, particularly the Black babies, that are driving such high numbers in our country, along within our states and even locally and county-wise as well. Certainly the case for Cuyahoga County, where we are in Ohio. And so the work that we do is very structured around supporting families of color, particularly African American families. And so we take into account the history of the African American experience in the United States, which from the very beginning has been of a traumatic nature. And so that trauma has been passed down for 400 years through generations. And so our work is to recognize that, acknowledge that, and create intervention services, such as what we have described so far, and to be able to, again, break those cycles. And what comes out of that, more so than anything else, is empowerment. And a part of it is, I often say that if there was more empowerment, there are a lot of issues that we would not be facing. But what trauma does is it steals your peace. It steals your level of peace so that you can think clearly, so that you can have clarity, and that you have awareness, and that you are even able to hold yourself accountable and the systems accountable for what they are supposed to do that they aren't doing. And so a part of this is helping people to become more confident in who they are and empowering them to take control of their own lives, and again, to hold themselves accountable, but also hold the systems in our country accountable as well. So part of our cultural intervention process is a continuous system of support. As I said, we spend up to 80 weeks with the clients. For the teen clients that come into our program, we stay with them until they graduate from high school. So we've had clients who come in to us who are 13, 14, 15. And so we stay with them so that we can support them in completing their educational goals and going on to pursue higher education if that is what they choose to do. We have a full-time staff of 7 between both offices, and then we have 14 independent contractors who we call perinatal support specialists, which is our own credential. And what that pretty much means is a doula, a super doula, or a doula on steroids, as we say, because A doula traditionally, a birth doula is traditionally someone who attends labor and delivery. You may have a meeting with them once before, once after. Postpartum doula, the same. In a sense, after the baby is born, the doula is there for X amount of time, depending on what the contract is that you all worked out with that client. But the perinatal support specialist is a holistic support system to where the doula services are built in to the broader services that we provide around classes. A part of that is the knowledge of self through history. We talk a lot about history because one of the things my grandmother used to always say was, and I truly believe, and it always stuck with me, is that in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you have been. And so if we forget or we don't acknowledge that our very first experience in the United States as African Americans, again, was one of trauma, then we won't know how to solve the issue. In order to be good problem solvers, we have to take into account what has happened and not dismiss it as being, oh, well, that was a long time. That was a long time ago. It's not a long time ago if the effects are still showing up in present day. So we are really serious about representation and empowerment. So back to Dr. Angela's slide around how it's important, as studies show, for there to be this cultural connection. So our staff is 100% African American women. And that is who the women that we see expect to see when they come into our office, when they are receiving services from us. It has benefited us in such ways to where the women tend to be a lot more open and sharing about their background. And the relatability factor is very important when you are looking into healing someone emotionally or helping to provide emotional health services, because that person needs to know that they can see themselves inside of you, and vice versa, that there's some level of understanding of what it is that you are experiencing. So we are dealing with, as African Americans, back to the trauma piece, we are dealing with at least 3 types of trauma at any given time, whether that's ancestral, vicarious trauma, or the personal traumas that we may experience as individuals within our lives. And at BBC, we make sure to address all 3 of those types of trauma through our services and our program. So I'm sorry, Dr. Anderson.
That's okay. We have about 6 minutes left because we're going to leave time for, in terms of leaving time for questions. And so okay. I'm looking at the chat. People are wondering about about our interventions, and particularly about our anxiety intervention and about our trauma intervention. So I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about that. So could we?
Sure. I see the first. Do you want to go ahead and start?
I think I want to talk very briefly about SOS.
Okay.
And about what we're doing in terms of trauma.
Okay. You can go ahead. It's the SOS slide.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to say is all of the things that Kristen has said is so very, very important. And all of this has come out of the research and the interventions research that we have done. We started off with doula-led sister circles, sisters offering support. And they were so successful, go to the next one, that they've actually become embedded in Birthing Beautiful communities. So if you come into Birthing Beautiful communities, you are assigned to an SOS sister circle. And this one is kind of hard to see, but what we do in there, we get this recognition. Women are able to get a recognition of stress. They get information about, about panic attacks, which many of them are having, and they thought was just part of normal life. Uh, we see the reductions of symptoms. Uh, the other thing that we see is that doulas can lead this intervention accurately, and it is well accepted by the women. But everything that Christian has said about trauma has come out in these circles. And so it became quite clear that we had to begin to treat this generational trauma. And for my researchers out there, there's not a lot of research out there on generational trauma. We talk about it a great deal in the Black community, but the research is just lacking. And Christian has very nicely articulated how we need to think about and theoretically, and then begin to investigate generational trauma in the lives of these women, because indeed it does affect the children, the children's children, etc.
So we talked about the different types of trauma. The last point I would make on this slide is around the culture of toxicity. And this goes back to the toxic stress. Well, definitely the toxic stress and what that looks like. So the isolation, if you're isolated, and if you are a person of color, and you live in poverty, that tends to increase the chances of you having toxic stress. And in turn, what oftentimes happens is then there's this level of toxicity to the mothering, right? So, and what I mean by mothering is what we think about in terms of how a child is nurtured, how a child is cared for, how a child receives love. And if that is a toxic process because no one has intervened to help that mother with her emotional health, then that is what creates a lot of the adverse childhood experiences. And so I came up with this model around what I call a manic model around what that looks like. And that's manipulation, abuse, neglect, intimidation, and contamination. And that really comes from this paradigm. If you all are familiar with the mother wound, which is rooted within white patriarchy, and how that goes from the white male patriarchy to the white female patriarchy to the black female matriarchy to the black male patriarchy. So it's this paradigm of the generational trauma, starting with, again, the first African Americans coming to the United States in Virginia, and just this cycle of manic behavior that is passed down through generations.
And so one of the things that we said was that we have to begin, and mothers were very clear to us, we need help. We need you to begin to address this. And my PTSD researchers, my PTSD interventionists know that PTSD seems to be underdiagnosed in this population. So we set up a generational treatment of trauma, and we began with these women who actually met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And we used WET, written exposure therapy. And we chose that because in SOS, the activity that women loved the most was writing and telling their own story. And then we have SOS as well. We bring those symptoms down, then SOS seems to be it's more amenable. Women are more amenable to it. It seems to have a greater impact. Christian talked about this manic model really speaks to this whole spirit of mothering piece. And then that we have to intervene, which I think is prevention in terms of the children, the younger children. I think we want to just wrap up and then open it up for questions. So we're going to try to just summarize. We just summarize what we hope you've learned today. So that's the next slide. That within, if we're talking about maternal and infant mortality, emotional health matters. And Kristen, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so just wrapping it up, I wanted to go back briefly to your mental health recommendations here, as Dr. Angela has described around brief treatments for stress anxiety. I'm happy to say that's Tajay Monroe that you see on the slide here, who presented at the Anxiety and Depression Association of America conference, who she leads the SOS circles and has the most contact with the moms. But what we found was that we wanted to have parenting tools, including a holistic treatment, delivering culturally informed care to the moms. And the trust factor is extremely important within this, within our organization and with the clients as well too. And that this is only possible because of the partnership that we have built over the years with Kent State University and Dr. Angela. So around just how we are approaching this is that, we are shifting our perspective around what it is that mothers need, and specifically African-American mothers, identifying what the needs are, setting our intentions about what is it that we want to see, be very specific, what do we want to see in 10 years, 20 years? I often say, if we can get a grasp around this toxic mothering and do intervention very early on, then we will see less incidences of community violence, for example. And then actually putting a plan into place. I think that there should be some legislation involved or some mandates involved in order to deliver the best care for moms that have the best chance at everyone sort of following a regulation and routine around that. And sort of what I just said, just to sum it up, we need to be assessing our moms for their emotional health fitness, and then providing counseling with perinatal support specialists or perinatal support professionals. So questions?
We do have some questions. So I'll go ahead and start. So the first question says, we know that African American women are commonly chronically stressed due to systemic racism. How well does the social risk assessment predict risk across social demographic? Is the social risk assessment available for use by other clinicians?
So currently the social risk assessment is being used by the perinatal support professionals, specifically within birth and beautiful communities. We did have it tested for its efficacy and its validity last year by Cleveland State University, and it did pass the validity and efficacy test. Currently, we are in a research study with Cleveland State University again, but this time we are testing it with some additional social risk indicators on it as well. As of yet, it isn't available to other organizations or clinicians. My hope is that it will be available at some point in time so that we are applying this across the board.
Okay. Postpartum depression is a hot topic, but in the mental health community, we do not have great or consistent data on the prevalence in African American women. How often are you seeing clinical depression or anxiety among the women you help?
You want to take that one, or do you want me to take that one, Kristen?
You can take that.
We see we have cases where where it's clear postpartum depression. What we see a lot of is the symptomatology. A group I didn't talk about is a group where we looking at hair cortisol, where it was off the charts for these pregnant mothers, and that's factoring in the fact that they were pregnant. And so and as we looked at what they told us, and this was in a focus group setting, we certainly saw high symptomatology of both depression and trauma. The fact is that we haven't seen a prevalence and epidemiological study that look at this. What we do know is that that the emotional health group interventions that we do make a difference. And then we also see women saying, I think I need more, and we make the referral for individual therapy. Kristen, anything you want to add to that?
So the city and county coalition here called First Year Cleveland supported a small group that was called PAO, Pregnancy and Infant Loss, but they just renamed their network as our Wellness Network. And that now consists of a robust roster of African American and other ethnicity counseling professionals, so psychologists, counselors, psychiatrists that have been vetted, thoroughly vetted, who can be, that the women can be referred to, as Dr. Angela just said, that we will refer out if someone needs additional support. And so it will actually become a program or a sector of BBC, because we see so many women on a continual basis, and so that there is a direct alignment in them receiving the services that they need right away, instead of us, trying to figure out whether or not they have followed up or had, if the referral went through. This allows us to keep better tabs on the full intervention.
Great, that looks to be all the questions we have. I want to thank Dr. Neal Barnett and Ms. Farmer-Kane, and thank you to our participants for attending today's training. We would like to invite you to register for ADAA's next live webinar on June 3rd, Treating Anxiety and Depression in Gender Diverse Populations with Dr. Lauren Wadsworth. We invite you to visit the ADAA website to view all upcoming live webinars, as well as our full library of on-demand webinars. If you are not yet a member of ADAA, we invite you to view the many membership benefits that ADAA has to offer. ADAA members enjoy year-long access to continuing education programs, free access to special interest groups, including online peer consultation groups, promotion of your practice in ADAA's online Find a Therapist database, significant discount to ADAA's annual conference, and much more. Please visit adaa.org to learn more. On behalf of ADAA and our presenters, we thank you very much for joining us today. And this concludes our webinar.
Thank you.